It was a Tuesday, not that the day itself mattered much, but I remember it was one of those dull, overcast mornings where nothing seemed extraordinary. I was at my desk, sipping lukewarm coffee and scrolling through the news, when the first reports started trickling in. At first, no one really believed it. Headlines screamed about strange lights in the sky and massive triangular ships appearing out of nowhere. People thought it was a hoax or some overblown government experiment finally coming to light. By the time the global live stream started, though, denial wasn't an option anymore. The Satirical Empire made their grand debut right above Earth's atmosphere. Their ships were massive, glittering things, floating silently like celestial gods. I remember how their sheer size blotted out the sky in some places, casting entire cities in shadow. They didn't try to speak to us at first. No radio signals, no attempts at diplomacy. They just hovered, waiting. Then came the broadcast. Every TV, every phone, every screen, big or small, it didn't matter if it was connected to a network or not. The Satirical patched in, and for the first time, humanity heard their voices. It wasn't a voice, really. More like a low, undulating series of clicks and vibrations that somehow translated into words. Their message was short, almost casual, as if they'd done this 100 times before. Surrender your resources. Pledge your allegiance to the Satirical Empire. Resistance will result in annihilation. That was it. No introductions, no declarations of friendship or cultural exchange, just a cold, mechanical demand. I could feel the tension in the air as I watched the broadcast. My coworkers were frozen, their faces pale as they stared at the screen in disbelief. Around the world, governments scrambled to respond. I heard later that some countries wanted to negotiate, to stall for time. But the United Nations took the lead. Our leaders, to their credit, didn't flinch. They delivered a unified response. Humanity would not bow. The Satirical didn't take rejection well. Their ships shifted position, and within hours they made their first move. A demonstration, they called it. A single bomb dropped on New York City. I wasn't there, but I'll never forget the footage. The bomb was like nothing we'd ever seen. A sleek obsidian sphere that glowed faintly as it fell. When it hit, it didn't just explode, it erased. Everything within a 100-mile radius was gone. Buildings, people, roads. It didn't matter. What was left wasn't rubble, just emptiness. A smooth, glassy crater that stretched farther than the eye could see. The news anchors tried to keep it together, but their voices shook. People screamed in the streets, panicked, terrified. I just sat there, numb, as my phone buzzed with messages from family and friends. Is this real? What do we do? Are we next? I didn't have answers. None of us did. All I knew was that humanity had just been given an impossible ultimatum, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly small. Humans are a funny species. We don't take kindly to threats, but we're also ridiculously stubborn. Even when we're outmatched, outgunned, and seemingly out of options, we cling to this absurd belief that we can fight back. Maybe it's arrogance, or maybe it's the sheer refusal to accept defeat. Either way, after the Satirical's demonstration, the world could have crumbled under fear. Instead, we got angry. It didn't happen all at once. At first, there was chaos. Panic in the streets, people hoarding supplies, rumors flying about what city would be hit next. Governments were overwhelmed, their leaders scrambling to maintain some semblance of order. But beneath the fear, something else began to simmer: defiance. It started small, with individuals who refused to let the Satirical decide our fate. Take Dr. Evelyn Ford, for instance. She was an aerospace engineer at NASA, and when the agency was evacuated after the New York bombing, she didn't leave. While everyone else packed up and fled to their bunkers, she stayed behind in the dark, surrounded by outdated computers and half-finished projects. "They think they can intimidate us," she reportedly said. "Let's show them they've made a mistake." Her defiance lit a spark. Soon, hackers around the globe started coordinating attacks on the Satirical's communication systems. It wasn't about doing any real damage. Our technology was primitive compared to theirs. But the idea was to be as annoying as possible. They managed to hijack one of the Zakrell's global broadcasts and replaced their ominous demands with a loop of Rick Astley's "Never Gonna Give You Up." For 2 straight hours, the entire world got to watch as the Zakrell ships hovered silently, their crews presumably baffled by the bizarre human noise assaulting their systems. Farmers in the Midwest got in on the action too. They started carving messages into their fields with tractors, creating massive crop circles that spelled out phrases like "nice try" and "bring it." In South America, an artist collective painted a giant middle finger on the side of a mountain that could be seen from orbit. Every little act of defiance sent a message. We weren't going to roll over and let them win. But it wasn't all fun and games. Governments worldwide pooled their resources, converting outdated military equipment into anything that could give us a fighting chance. Decommissioned satellites were dragged out of storage and retrofitted with makeshift weapons. Engineers worked around the clock to figure out ways to disrupt the Zakrell systems. It was like trying to bring down a tank with a slingshot. But we didn't care. What the Zakrell didn't understand, what they couldn't understand, was that humans are petty. You threaten our homes, our families, and we don't just fight back. We make it personal. It wasn't about victory anymore. It was about making sure the Zakrell knew that no matter how advanced they were, they'd pick the wrong species to mess with. And so, the world didn't break. It bristled. The Zakrell had set the stage, but humanity had chosen the tone. And that tone was defiance, wrapped in a layer of pure, unfiltered spite. By the time day 42 rolled around, the Zakrell were still circling the planet like vultures, watching, waiting for us to crack. They'd delivered their message, shown off their overwhelming power, and probably expected us to grovel. Instead, we'd spent the last 6 weeks getting under their skin, well, if they even had skin. We'd hijacked their broadcasts, disrupted their operations, and turned our collective rage into a series of relentless, irritating acts of defiance. But none of it had really hurt them. Not yet. Then came the shipping containers. It started as a whispered rumor among the resistance, a bizarre plan that sounded like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. Someone, no one ever admitted who, suggested that if we couldn't attack their ships directly, we could at least throw something at them. Not missiles, not lasers, something they wouldn't see coming, something harmless looking but deadly. That's how we ended up filling old shipping containers with hundreds of thousands of hacked smartphones. The idea was so simple it was almost absurd. The phones were loaded with malware, programs designed to exploit any vulnerabilities in their systems. We didn't know if it would work. Hell, we didn't even know if the phones would survive the trip, but we were desperate, and desperate people get creative. The operation began under the cover of darkness. Modified rockets launched the containers into low orbit, where they were programmed to home in on the Zakrell ships using primitive guidance systems. The Zakrell, confident in their technological superiority, didn't even bother to intercept them. Why would they? To them, we were throwing rocks at gods. But those rocks hit their mark. When the first container struck one of their ships, the smartphones embedded themselves into the hull using magnetic locks. Within minutes, the malware activated, worming its way into their systems. The effects were immediate. Lights flickered across the ship's surface, and it began to list awkwardly, as if its gravity controls were failing. Soon, similar reports started coming in from around the world. Ship after ship was hit, and one by one, they began to falter. And then came the laughter. Some genius programmer, bless their twisted sense of humor, had included an audio payload with the malware. Every hacked system began broadcasting a loop of human laughter, distorted and eerie, like the planet itself was mocking them. You could hear it on their ship's external speakers, echoing across the sky. For the first time, the Zakrell. I'll never forget the moment one of their captains tried to make a broadcast to counter our attack. The image was garbled, the sound a mess of static and shrieking clicks. They were scrambling, completely unprepared for the chaos we'd unleashed. For the first time since their arrival, humanity wasn't just reacting. We were pushing back. It wasn't a victory, at least not yet. The Zakrel still had their fleet, their weapons, their overwhelming advantage. But for one glorious moment, we made them sweat. And that, I think, was the turning point, because now they knew what we were capable of. We weren't just their next conquest, we were their problem. The Zakrel must have thought they were finally breaking us when they deployed their ground forces. After the shipping container stunt, their orbiting fleet had pulled back slightly, but they weren't about to let us think we'd actually accomplished anything meaningful, so they changed tactics. Instead of simply hovering over us and raining terror from above, they decided to come down to Earth and show us just how superior they were. Their landing ships descended in force, sleek and ominous, carving through the atmosphere like falling daggers. They targeted major cities, what was left of them, and strategic locations around the globe. New York had been obliterated, but they hit Los Angeles, London, Tokyo, and Rio de Janeiro next. The footage from their landings was broadcasted worldwide, whether we liked it or not. Soldiers in gleaming armor marched out in perfect formation, weapons glowing with a cold, alien energy. Their movements were precise, almost mechanical. They looked invincible. But the Zakrel, for all their technological advancements, had made one critical miscalculation. They had no idea what they were walking into. Earth isn't just a planet, it's a battlefield, and its most formidable warrior isn't human, it's nature. The first signs of trouble for the Zakrel came from their own reports, intercepted by our hackers. Their troops were experiencing environmental resistance. At first, we didn't know what that meant, but then the videos started circulating. Picture this: a squad of Zakrel soldiers marching through Central Park, their perfect white armor reflecting the sunlight. It looked like something out of a sci-fi epic until one of them suddenly stopped, clutching at their face. Or whatever they had for a face. Seconds later, another dropped their weapon and started convulsing. The rest began to panic, their perfect formation crumbling as they staggered, stumbled, and collapsed. The cause? Pollen. Turns out the Zakrel weren't ready for Earth's biosphere. Our air, thick with microorganisms, allergens, and pollutants, was like poison to their highly sensitive physiology. Their armor, designed to withstand bullets and lasers, couldn't filter out the microscopic invaders assaulting their systems. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. Their troops were sneezing uncontrollably, their alien lungs wheezing as they tried to adapt to the cocktail of irritants we call air. And it wasn't just pollen. Bacteria and viruses jumped hosts with terrifying efficiency, spreading through their ranks like wildfire. In South America, a contingent of Zakrel infantry abandoned their landing site after being swarmed by mosquitoes. In Australia, they encountered venomous spiders and snakes. In India, a sudden monsoon left an entire battalion stranded in knee-deep mud, their advanced machinery useless in the face of Earth's chaotic weather. We didn't even have to fight them directly. Nature did the work for us. All we had to do was watch and adapt. We started planting fast-growing crops near their landing zones, increasing pollen production. Farmers released swarms of insects, and researchers redirected their efforts into studying how Earth's ecosystems could be weaponized. By the time the Zakrel realized their mistake, they were too far in to pull out. Their soldiers were sick, demoralized, and dying in droves. The great Zakrel Empire, conquerors of countless worlds, had been brought to its knees by the sheer audacity of Earth itself. We laughed. For the first time since they arrived, we laughed, because the Zakrel had thought they were invading a primitive world. Instead, they had stepped into the most hostile, unrelenting battlefield they had ever known. The Zakrel, stubborn as they were, didn't retreat after their humiliating defeat at the hands of pollen, mosquitoes, and mud. No, they doubled down. They adjusted their tactics, deploying specialized environmental suits and automated drones to handle what their troops couldn't. If nature was going to fight them, they were determined to fight back. But the thing about humanity, the thing they clearly hadn't grasped yet, was that we learn fast. We adapt faster. And when we get backed into a corner, we don't just claw our way out. We come out swinging. By this point, the resistance wasn't just a ragtag collection of hackers and farmers pulling petty stunts. It was a global movement, coordinated and relentless. Military leaders from every corner of the world were working together, sharing resources, tactics, and most importantly, ideas. The lines between soldiers, civilians, and scientists blurred. Everyone had a role to play. Take the engineers in Scandinavia, for example. They figured out how to weaponize the auroras. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but they managed to channel the energy from solar winds to create localized electromagnetic pulses. When the Zacrel drones flew into those zones, they dropped out of the sky like swatted flies. In the Pacific, fishermen rigged their boats with makeshift torpedo systems, turning the ocean into a minefield. And then there were the hackers, who had upgraded from rickrolling the Zacrel to outright sabotaging their systems. Entire squads of alien drones would suddenly freeze mid-separation, their software hijacked by lines of human code. And it wasn't just the professionals. Civilians got creative too. In one particularly memorable instance, a small town in Texas lured a Zacrel patrol into a trap using nothing but fireworks and decoy heat signatures. When the aliens moved in to investigate, the locals hit them with everything they had. Homemade explosives, hunting rifles, even a repurposed grain silo that had been turned into a makeshift cannon. The footage of the aftermath went viral, showing a dozen shattered Zacrel suits scattered across a field, surrounded by jubilant humans waving flags and toasting with beer. The turning point, though, came when we finally cracked their tech. It wasn't easy. Their systems were light years ahead of ours, but there's something to be said for human ingenuity. A team of scientists working out of an abandoned research facility in Siberia managed to reverse engineer one of their drones. It took weeks of trial and error, but when they finally succeeded, it changed everything. Now we had their playbook. We knew how their weapons worked, how their ships operated, even how their suits filtered air. And once we understood their technology, we started to improve on it. Their sleek, sterile designs weren't built for Earth's chaos, but ours were. We adapted their weapons to work in the mud, the rain, the scorching heat, and the freezing cold. We turned their drones against them, using their own tools to dismantle their operations, piece by piece. The Zacrel were used to steamrolling over civilizations that couldn't comprehend their power. They weren't prepared for an enemy that didn't just fight back, but thrived on the chaos. With every skirmish, we grew stronger, and with every defeat, the Zacrel looked less like invincible conquerors and more like a desperate, flailing force trying to control a planet that refused to be tamed. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were winning. The Zacrel should have left. By the time their forces were staggering under the weight of Earth's resistance, it would have been the smart move. Cut their losses, regroup, and find an easier planet to bully. But no, they stayed. Maybe it was pride, or maybe they were too arrogant to believe they could lose to a bunch of primitive creatures. Whatever their reasoning, they stuck around. And that was their biggest mistake. Because by the time we reached day 100 of the invasion, humanity wasn't just fighting back. We were taking the fight to them. The first human strike on a Zacrel mothership came from a coalition of nations operating out of a hidden base in the Alps. Using the tech we'd reverse engineered, they'd cobbled together a hybrid craft, part human ingenuity, part alien engineering. It wasn't sleek or elegant like the Zacrel ships. It was ugly, covered in patches and scars, a Frankenstein's monster of a vehicle. But it flew. And when it flew, it roared. The craft broke through the Zacrel's orbital defenses with a combination of brute force and tactical precision. We'd learned how to bypass their shields, exploiting gaps in their frequency modulation. By the time they realized what was happening, the ship had already docked with one of their massive carriers. The crew, an international team of soldiers, scientists, and engineers, stormed the ship, carrying weapons that combined human firepower with stolen Zakrel tech. What followed was chaos. The Zakrel hadn't prepared for close-quarters combat. They relied on drones and long-range strikes. They weren't ready for humans charging down their sterile, white corridors, shouting war cries in a dozen languages, and firing weapons they barely understood. The footage from the mission, captured by helmet cams, became an instant symbol of defiance. It wasn't just about the destruction we caused, though. The real victory was the intel we gathered. The strike team accessed the Zakrel's central database, pulling files that detailed their operations, their weaknesses, and, most importantly, their homeworld. For the first time, we had leverage, and we used it. Humanity's leaders broadcasted a message to the Zakrel fleet, but this time, we weren't pleading or negotiating. We were delivering an ultimatum. "Leave our planet," the message said, "or we'll bring the fight to yours." At first, the Zakrel dismissed it as a bluff. They thought we wouldn't dare. But then the second strike hit, and this time, it wasn't just a single mothership. 3 more carriers were targeted, their systems sabotaged, their crews overwhelmed. The message was clear: humanity wasn't backing down. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the resistance had evolved into something more: an army. Factories that once produced cars and appliances were churning out weapons and vehicles. Universities became research hubs, their brightest minds working tirelessly to improve our tech. Even children got involved, helping to program drones or assembling gear in makeshift workshops. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about showing the Zakrel that they'd picked the wrong species to mess with. And as our ships began to rise into the skies, carrying the fight beyond Earth, one thing became certain. We weren't just defending our planet. We were coming for theirs. By the time humanity's ships left Earth's atmosphere to face the Zakrel head-on, the world was unrecognizable. The scars of invasion were everywhere. Entire cities wiped off the map, landscapes forever altered, and billions grieving for the lives lost. But beneath the rubble, something extraordinary had taken shape. Humanity, fractured and divided for so long, had become something new. We weren't nations, and the first human fleet wasn't large, at least not compared to the Zakrel Armada, but it was ours, and every ship carried the weight of Earth's hope. They were crafted in factories that had once built cars and planes, modified with alien tech scavenged from the battlefield. They were crude, cobbled together, and ugly by Zakrel standards, but they worked. And as they rose into the void, their engines roaring against the silence of space, we knew we were making history. The Zakrel must have thought we were insane, a species barely out of its own solar system challenging a galactic empire that had conquered countless worlds. It probably seemed like the ultimate act of hubris, but they didn't understand us. They didn't understand that we weren't fighting to conquer or expand. We were fighting because we had no choice. The first battle in space was chaos. The Zakrel ships, sleek and precise, moved like sharks in the darkness, while our human ships were clumsy and unpredictable by comparison. But unpredictability, as it turned out, was our greatest weapon. The Zakrel were used to enemies who played by the rules of logic, who followed predictable patterns. We didn't. We fought like cornered animals, with a desperation they couldn't match. Our hybrid ships, equipped with both human and alien tech, were designed to exploit the weaknesses we'd uncovered. Their shields, once impenetrable, were now vulnerable to the energy disruptors we'd developed. Their drones, once deadly, could be hijacked and turned against them. And their ships, once untouchable, were now targets for our kamikaze strike. The Zakrel weren't ready for the sheer audacity of human tactics. We didn't fight to win. We fought to hurt them, to make them bleed. Every ship we lost was a devastating blow, but every Zakrel ship we took down was a victory that echoed across the cosmos. And with each battle, we got better. We learned, we adapted, and we hit harder. Then came the final gambit. Using the data we'd stolen during our raids, we pinpointed the Zakrel's homeworld. It was a jewel in the darkness, a planet brimming with life and resources, protected by layers of defenses that had stood for centuries. But it wasn't untouchable. Our fleet didn't have the firepower to destroy their world outright, and we didn't need to. The goal wasn't annihilation. It was humiliation. We dropped payloads of viral malware into their global systems, broadcasted Earth's defiant message across their cities, and disabled their planetary defenses in one coordinated strike. We made sure they knew that the primitives from Earth had reached their doorstep. And then we left. By the time the Zakrel could respond, we were gone, their world in chaos. Back on Earth, the fleets returned battered but victorious. The Zakrel Empire didn't collapse overnight, but the cracks had been made, and they knew better than to return. We had done the impossible. We had fought off the invincible. We had made the Zakrel bleed, and for the first time in human history, we weren't just survivors. We were conquerors.